Welcome back. The average age of the first-time property buyer in Sydney is 38. So you can imagine what it was like last weekend when an 8-year-old boy turned up at auction. Not only did he start bidding, but he was the highest bidder and ultimately bought the property at a touch under $1 million. Now, there is a backstory. The boy was unable to directly buy the property because of his age, but his property developer father said he purchased the investment properties for him to teach him about property. Now, it raises some questions about how old you have to be to have your name on a contract. Garth Brown from Brown and Brown Solicitors joins me. Garth, can an 8-year-old boy legally buy a property?
Yes, well, Veronica, the answer is yes. But the 8-year-old will lack what's known as legal capacity because he's not over 18, he's a minor. So we'll talk a little bit about that later. And particularly for minors, for that minor to go on title, onto a new title after settlement, there are more hoops for that conveyance to include. So what happens is that for that new deed, particularly New South Wales, they need to submit a signed certificate from a lawyer, from the New South Wales trustee or the guardianship, pursuant to Section 29 of the Minors Act. So please stay with me on that one.
Right. And why do they need that one? Can I sort of jump in?
Yeah, well, it's basically that the minor knows what they're getting involved with because they're not of an age to really understand what they're doing. And within that certificate, there needs to be such things as that the solicitor who's providing that must be independent, so he mustn't be representing the buyer or the seller in that conveyance. It has to be someone outside of that contract arrangement. The lawyer has to be satisfied that the minor knows what they're doing, and that also too that certificate, whoever's supplying that, a lawyer or the guardianship or the trustee, that minor hasn't been forced into that transaction. And there's a couple of other items that are required there, is that the person who's giving that certificate, they also need a statement from a valuer or a financial advisor stating that, again, that the minor knows what they're doing, but that the purchase price is not manifestly excessive.
Wow. So there's quite a few hoops.
Yeah, and even after they're registered with that documentation, that needs to be 7 days before settlement in New South Wales. So it won't be a PEXA transaction, it'll be a paper one.
Right.
They need to... they will be registered on title as their name, but in brackets, a minor after will be inserted on the title. So whoever's dealing with that title will know, well, hang on, I'm dealing with a minor here.
Right. So it's pretty clear for everyone to know. But on that one, and I'll come back to the PEXA point in a minute because that's interesting, but also they've got to presumably get finance in some way for this property. So what complications might there be in terms of, getting a mortgage?
Well, this is the thing, because the person's not over 18, they won't have contractual legal capacity. So to have that enforced against them, it just won't happen because they're a minor. You can't enforce provisions of default when someone doesn't have contractual capacity. So I don't think there'd be any bank that would lend any money. So you basically have to be a cash buyer as a minor, or you have a rich relative.
Right. And what about an owner? I mean, if I was selling my house and someone turns up saying, well, look, my 8-year-old boy wants to buy this and I've got all this documentation, but I can't actually, maybe the contract's not enforceable, for instance, because he is a minor, why would I want to sell to him?
Well, it's risky. You've got to be aware of this. And these types of transactions are rare as hen's teeth. But you need to be aware that if you do buy or sell to a minor, you do have the prospect of that contract or that settlement not completing, and there's nothing you can do about it because the person doesn't have legal capacity.
Wow.
So you need to be aware of that risk.
Would you think most auctioneers are aware of this? Because I would imagine, the agents there, particularly in New South Wales, you have to register to bid at auction. They're all lining up, they're registering. So here you go, here's my son, it's all good. I've got all this documentation. You go, okay, fine, every bid is good, and then all of a sudden they bought it and the vendor didn't even realise that there was this risk.
Well, probably not. If I was an agent, you'd be wanting to get an exchange of contracts, get a commission together, and hopefully just manage it all the way through and make sure that do whatever you can to make sure it gets across the line. But there is a risk that this particular minor could walk away and say, I'm not completing.
Wow. Now, you also mentioned that about PEXA. Now, for those who don't know, of course, PEXA is e-conveyancing or digital conveyancing. Now, I understand that New South Wales has actually legislated there's a date at which it becomes enforceable that no more paper transactions. So what would that mean for an 8-year-old that wanted to buy after that date?
Yeah, well, that's true. I mean, in 2019, it became mandatory to settle on PEXA, but there are some particular paper transactions that at this point of time can't be facilitated on PEXA. So I'm assuming with this sort of transaction, which is quite rare, there's not a lot of casework or cases on this subject, but it's something that PEXA is gradually integrating these different forms that you can upload and be able to substantiate what you're doing that would be facilitated into the system. But I think it hasn't got that far with PEXA at this point. So you'd have to go back to paper in this sort of 1 in 100, 1% of transactions, even less.
I'd personally have to question really whether bidding at auction is teaching your child much about property per se. But how would you advise a client if an 8-year-old walked into your office and said they wanted to buy a property?
Well, I think I'd look at the parents, because I've got a 14-year-old daughter, which we love a lot and we dearly love her, and she's learning online at the moment because of the pandemic. But what if we had a relationship breakdown? My child had, we want good things for her, but when they start getting 18, 19, even 16, things can start to turn around. So it is a risk that, your children are obedient, or maybe they become disobedient, and that can create a lot of trouble. So that's something that you want good things for your children, but you pray that things actually are cordial as time goes on. I think that's to be aware of.
Are you suggesting that they could sell it and do other less smart things with their money?
Well, yeah, I actually question whether it is the right thing to do for a child to buy at 8. They need a bit more experience in life and understanding money, but that's what makes the world go round.
Or even saving a deposit. It takes apparently 12 years to save a deposit in Sydney, or 9 in Melbourne, but that's a whole other topic. Thank you so much for joining us, Garth, and explaining this. And I have to say, it does sound a lot more complex than even I expected. And thank you all for joining us this week. I'll be back next week.
Thank you.